With that, I think I'm going to introduce Jack.
Thank you very much. It is a pleasure to be here.
Thank you, Jack.
I'm from Sixel Consulting Group. I'm our Director of Market Analysis. I joined the company in, I'm trying to remember, 2001. And there were 2.5 of us at Sixel Consulting Group doing air service development. And today there are over 20 of us based all around North America, and we have operations in Russia now. And I think we've grown because we share a lot of the same ideals that AirIT shares, and that is trying to be on the cutting edge of what's next in the industry in order to better position our clients for success. I was going to try and do a joke or something to warm the crowd up, you know, but then I realized I'm really bad at telling jokes, and so I probably shouldn't do that. So I was asking my office staff, you know, what should I start with? And one of them said, in fact, the youngest member of our staff said, well, why don't you just be genuine? And I said, that's quite an idea. Why don't I be genuine? And so I thought, before we get into the agenda of what I want to talk about, I thought that I would just start out with a quote from one of my favorite people in this industry, and probably many of you in the room have had the opportunity to meet him. He's from Southwest, and it's not Herb. John Giammatta, longtime planner, network planner with Southwest, Vice President of Planning at Southwest. He once told me, we exist to connect people to the things that are important in their lives. That's it. We exist to connect people to things that are important in their lives. And that is the core idea that drives me every single day of work. When people ask me what I do, I say I connect communities and I connect people. And all of us in this room do just that. And AirIT does just that. Sixel Consulting Group, the airports, the airlines, the associated companies here. Our job is to make life better for people by connecting them to the things that are important to them. And I want that to be the underlying theme that we think about as we go through what the next 20 or 30 years might look like for airports and airlines in the country. So we decided to just take a super simple concept and make it as complicated as we possibly could. So that's what we've done today. So we're going to talk about the future of airports, which when I got the topic and started thinking about it, I thought, how are we ever going to do this? But I think we've come up with some interesting things, at least for us to think about and move forward after today and make us think about how we do our jobs and you know, what's going on in the industry. So we're going to start out with challenges in the industry. We have to start out with where we've been over the last 5 years, the last 10 years, how we've gotten to the point where we are today, and what that means as we look forward into the future, consolidation, the loss of air service. We'll talk about the financial challenges that all of us face, airports, airlines. I really want to delve into this funding system we have in the U.S. because this is one of the big things when our firm looks forward, we think is going to be tremendously important to the future of airports and airlines serving those airports, and that is coming up with a stable funding system. Our current funding system is inadequate. If you're from Canada, it's even worse, and we'll talk about that. So I apologize to the Canadians in the room. I do a lot of work in Canada. The Canadian system is even more antiquated than ours. We'll talk about lower airport costs and how to leverage low costs for additional flights and additional passenger revenue. And then the future of airport funding, what we see as the future of airports, flexible facilities. That really drills down into what AirIT does, and I'm preaching to the choir when I talk about flexible facilities. But it's utilizing every single resource you have as well as you can to make sure you can best link your community to opportunities. So with that in mind, let's look back to 2001. This is a chart of airline capacity, 2001, basically to the current period, and you can see the seasonality. That's why it's all jagged. But the big thing I want to note, since 2001, airlines have cut an average of 21,000 peak daily departing seats. So today we have 21,000 fewer departing seats every single day, just domestically in the United States, that we had just a decade ago. That is a massive cut. That is hundreds of flights we have lost that have not come back So we talk about the rebound of the industry. The industry has rebounded, but we're still not where we were before. And that's hurt airports quite clearly. Fuel prices are the base cost factor that's affecting every decision that's made, that affects airports, that affects airlines. So I want to show you what I saw at Chicago O'Hare not long ago. This was on the message board at the United Terminal. Please hook up all PC Air GPUs, ground power units, oil at 110 a barrel. So this affects not only big planning ideas and initiatives and expansion, this affects the everyday guy who is marshaling in an airplane because it's his job to ensure the airline can save as much money as possible. That's amazing when you think about it. It pervades the entire structure of an airline to the people right on the front line. That's how critical it is. And as oil either stays here or goes up, as it most likely will, we're going to see more and more of this where it's going to be everyone's job to think about the cost basis of every single seat that's flown and how to best leverage those costs for revenue and profit. So this is, again, that seat chart. These are the available seats. And I want to put over the top of that the price of fuel. So if we go back into the early 2000s, we were at 74 cents a gallon. I mean, that seems unbelievable. That's for jet fuel. And now we're over $3 a gallon. So it's quite clear that the price of fuel has caused the loss of seats. If you lay them over top, you can just see it perfectly. Now, we did have this huge spike in 2008 that very thankfully went away and came back, but this is the new normal. This is what airlines are having to adjust to. It's what the economy is having to adjust to. And frankly, by pulling those seats out of the system, airlines have done a great job adjusting to it. So, one of the ways you adjust to costs increasing and less control over cost is by controlling more of your market and more of your pricing. And airlines have done that through consolidation. So when we look back to 1978, these were the main carriers when the industry was deregulated in the United States. So there are 18 large carriers in the United States in 1978. Now, if we look at today, or not today, sorry, 1990, we'll get to today. I was just too excited. I wanted to be there right now. If we look at 1990, we saw some consolidation in that period. The mid-'80s, things kind of were shaking out. TWA and Ozark got together. Pan Am went into Delta and United in its respective sections of the globe. But when we got to 2000, things really started to squeeze down to where we only had 8 or 9 main carriers. It's almost like, and we were talking about this, it's almost like a NCAA tournament. So I hope that in 1978 you all picked the right airline, because at least you're still in it, because we're down to the final 4. Hopefully you got one of those. So we've got 4 left, 4 big guys. Now I don't mean to offend JetBlue and Alaska and Spirit and those carriers. They're tremendously important to our national aviation system, our international aviation system. But these big 4 have over 85% of all the capacity in this country. They're huge. And because of that, they have more pricing power. And what happens from here? Probably not a lot more consolidation, because the Department of Justice eventually, you would think, would have something to say about it. But this is where we are today. And of course, this consolidation has led hubs to close. And when hubs close, communities lose access to the transportation system. And that's happened as well. So we, of course, had San Jose that lost the American hub. They've rebounded pretty nicely, I would say. We have Dallas that lost Delta, but American redoubled in Dallas. Delta just couldn't compete. Of course, US Airways in Pittsburgh. American in St. Louis. That hub was superfluous once we got into the post-9/11 era. Delta in Cincinnati, that hub was sandwiched between others when Southwest and AirTran and Midwest and Republic and Frontier all got together. The Milwaukee operation was reduced dramatically. Memphis closed in the last 12 months. Delta didn't need that hub anymore. It has hubs all around it. And finally, Just this month, Cleveland and United closed. That hub, many of us thought would go away eventually, and all it took was a quirk in the pilot regulations that overnight made flying regional jets tremendously unprofitable from that hub, and that hub was gone. So this is the capacity that we've lost in the country, and this is capacity that's not coming back. So these airports that have had service into these hubs have had to be very nimble in how they recruit additional service and be very mindful of their airline cost in order not to scare current and future service away. So the big four, I mentioned this, and I just want to quickly show this. The big four, and a couple of these little things have fallen out, but I can assure you these are the big four airlines. They have 84% of all United States capacity. Alaska about 4%, JetBlue 3.5%, so on and so forth. But they really do hold that pricing power because of all that capacity. The other thing that's a little frightening, if you're a medium hub airport on down, which I think, well, I know the vast majority of airports are medium hub or smaller, is that we in the US and in North America rely on smaller planes a lot more than other parts of the world. And so as smaller planes are squeezed by pilot regulations and by fuel prices, we have a lot more to lose here. You look at this, about 50% of our capacity is on planes that have 50 seats or fewer. So that's either small regional jets, large regional jets, or turboprops. 50% of our capacity. You compare that to South America, where it's about 35%. You look at Europe, where it's about 28%. Look at Asia. It's less than 25%. It's about 15% of Asian capacity that's in these smaller aircraft. So we are at a real disadvantage. Our airports are at a real disadvantage moving forward because of the reliance on planes that are not as efficient as the planes that are being used around the world. So because of that, we have seen a number of airports that have lost service. These are lower 48 airports, so lower 48 of the US, that had any scheduled service. In 1995, we had 513 of them. Today, we have 419. Now, if you look at service with only regionals, we've gone from 329 airports with service to just 256. And I don't say all of this to scare everybody and to say it's doom and gloom, because we've seen a lot of air service development in this time. But I think it's important for us to understand we're competing for a resource that's increasingly limited, and you're not competing against the airport that's next door. You're competing against airports all over this continent for that airplane. And so everything you can do to bring costs down is going to help you retain that service, even if it means someone else is losing it. And so we know airports are losing that service. We know that's going to continue to happen. We have to constantly be cognizant of how to support what we have. So, financial challenges for airports. We understand the funding system, the challenges with it, we'll go into that. But also think about what we can do as airports to try and improve finance as well. So, I mentioned at the beginning the funding system is antiquated, and it is here in the US. And I'm going to focus on the US, but I will mention Canada briefly. So the airlines, of course, were deregulated in 1978, and of course airports were not. Almost all of our airports in the US are public entities. In fact, there's only one that's not. And so airlines are put in a position where they have to compete on the basis of their own merit. And airports were not given that same flexibility. And that's a big problem when you have these two systems that don't talk to each other necessarily. In 1978, airports just had to be access points for their communities. They needed to be available for the businesses that wanted to come in. And in many cases, the government, well, in all cases, the government told the airline where to fly, how often to fly, and what the fare was going to be. So each airport was assured of the service that they were going to have. And of course, in deregulation, all that went away, but the airport still had every bit of the cost basis that they had before, just no assurance that they were going to have service to pay for it. And so that's what happened. In 2014, we have airports in competition with each other every airport in this room is in competition with every other airport in this room. We don't want to think about it that way. It just doesn't seem fair. It doesn't seem right. Why is Greenville-Spartanburg competing with Portland, Maine? Because the resource is limited. That's why. So I think it's important for us to understand competitors are not just the nearby airports. And they're not going to be as we move forward. In fact, as we move forward, your competitors are going to be on different continents. They're going to be all over the world. So these are important concepts. So airlines, I showed you, have consolidated. We're down to the final four. We're going to see who's the champion. Airports have not consolidated. I want to show you an example of how airports in one region compete for airline capacity. Look at the LA basin. So we have these 5 big airports in the LA basin that all have service: LA, Long Beach, Ontario, Orange County, and Burbank. Of those 5 airports, there is no consolidated planning for the basin. So when we plan highways, when we plan any kind of public transit, we're planning between communities for the benefit of a region, typically. Not always, but typically. When we plan airports, we don't even think about the airport next door. In this case, you have Los Angeles World Airports that tried to consolidate planning between LA and Ontario, at least, 2 of the airports. And what happened is Ontario wants its airport back because LAX is ignoring them, and they want to compete on their own merit with all the other airports that are in the LA basin. More airports, though, puts a lot of financial strain on our system. Now, I'm not advocating that we consolidate into one big airport in the LA basin. I'm merely pointing out that because of the way airports in a region can compete with each other, we have far greater financial need to support all these facilities than we would if we had just several facilities. And don't ask me to pick winners here because I'm biased, and I won't even mention who my winners would be. Airport expenses also have been growing because facilities are aging, and we don't have a great mechanism to ensure that we keep them up. The support is limited. If we're being nice, we can say it's limited. We have our capital that we have to keep going. Expansion, if we have money for it, but of course you got to keep the runways going and you have to keep up with technology. We have our operating expenses, our maintenance, materials, equipment. In many cases, airports just barely can cover these expenses. And of course, we have our personnel, staff and contractors. So those are the big places. I'm not telling anything you don't already know. I'm saying this is a basis for where we're going to go in this discussion. So we have all of those needs, and yet we rely upon very uncertain funding, and I will get into more specifics about specifically this one-time revenue in just a minute. We have our AIP, Airport Improvement Projects, and we have our grant money, but that money has either stayed the same or has shrunk basically every year over the last 5 years. At the same time, the airline revenue has been squeezed because almost everyone in this room has seen capacity cut. And if you haven't, you're doing something really great. And aeronautical revenue is being squeezed because the amount of private aviation is being reduced. And we're no experts in private aviation, but we see it affect the bottom line of our airports very frequently, causing airline rates and charges to go up, which is the last thing that you want to do. So with the FAA specifically, the funding there keeps taking major hits. And I'll walk you through some of these. And some of you may say, oh, you're being unfair about that hit. So we have room to disagree on, I guess, the long-term impact of many of these things we'll talk about. And it's fine if we do disagree, but I'm just bringing them up as points of discussion. So one-time revenue has taken major hits as we've moved forward here since 2012 in the FAA reauthorization. Of course, we waited for that reauthorization for years and years and years, and then when we got it, we said, that's reauthorization? They didn't address many of the things that we've been asking them to address. It's not there. So it did finally pass, but it didn't fix any of the long-term budget issues that we have. In 2013, this is the controversy. In 2013, we had the AIP funding transfer. And I know a lot of you probably know about this, but essentially what happened is that 250+ million was moved from AIP to operations. Now that was done to fund the contract towers. So we had to fund the contract towers. We all understand the value of those towers and what they needed to keep operating. But this sets a dangerous precedent. And that is that this money from the Aviation Trust Fund that's set aside so that we can ensure that our facilities work and are safe is being used for actual operations of facilities year after year. And that's a little bit frightening because we don't know what that means in the future. Sure, now we think, oh, it was a one-time thing maybe and it won't happen again. But what this tells us is that AIP is not safe in its current form, and that money can be used for other things. And so we can't always rely upon it the same way that we've thought we could rely upon it. Of course, in 2014, this year, about $1 billion in FAA cuts. It's making the Canadian folks in the room feel really good to hear all this stuff. Oh, yes, finally, a level playing field. The AIP is supposed to be protected. It is, of course, the Airport and Airway Trust Fund. But again, this precedent, I think it's important for us to think about that. Now, on this note, our Canadian friends, let's just talk just a little bit about this, because we work for Canadian airports, and these financial challenges seem like child's play compared to some of theirs. In many cases, I don't think I can say most, but in many cases, Canadian airports have to lease the land that they operate on from the federal government. And so they have to pay for the right to use the facilities that are their own. And so their rates and charges have to be sufficiently high so that they can reimburse the government for the thing that is there for access. So the government is essentially taking money out of the airports to fund other things in Canada, where we still have the government funneling money into airports in the United States. So there's a big difference there, and there's a lot of work being done. And I'm going to be talking about that at the Jumpstart Conference in June. A lot of work to be done on basically changing the way Canadian airports are funded and changing the way they use the land that they're on. So that's just an aside. Sometimes I get sidetracked, but I thought it was important to make those comments. The last two things here, we've seen a lot of deferred maintenance. And of course, NextGen was supposed to be operating the new air traffic control system where we could actually make use of all of this air we have above us that still hasn't been instituted. And so we have a very old way of controlling airplanes that causes needless delay and adds tremendous expense to the airlines, and then the airlines come back to the airports and say, we got to reduce our expenses because we have no control over this. And that's the absolute truth. So, FAA funding and PFCs. I want to talk about PFCs, and this is going to make, if airlines in the room are going to get really nervous, so everybody would just calm down. Just take a deep breath, and we'll get through this. I'm not advocating for anything here. I'm bringing things up as points of discussion. Keep that in mind. So traditional revenue sources, as we have pointed out, are not stable. So we have to come up with ways then to generate enough revenue without scaring all of our airlines away so that our community is disconnected from all of the things that are important to our community. Because in the end, that's what we're doing, remember? We're connecting people to things that are important. That's what we live for. And so we're figuring out ways to do that. So, with all these budget cuts, they've come despite the fact, and this is an important point, federal tax money does not fund your airports. Your income tax does not fund your airports. When you see a story in a newspaper that says, all of this federal tax has gone to support our airports. Yes, it's true. Federal tax does go to your airports. It's from ticket fees. It's a user fee and not a general tax. It drives me crazy to have so many people who tell me EAS should be eliminated because my tax money shouldn't go to it. EAS is mostly funded through overflight fees from foreign carriers who fly through our airspace. It's not your tax money. So we need to be on message here. Airports get very little support from tax money. It is user fees. And I know I've been a little vociferous about that, but it gets me very charged up, and when I get charged up, I talk a lot. So these are some of the fees that go to fund our airports. Passenger facility charges, though, I said I was going to make people nervous. Of course, we're capped at $4.50. And that has worked for some time, but is it sufficient? The carriers in the room, of course, would say if you raise the PFC, you're going to deter ticket purchases because the ticket price will go up. And that is true. At the same time, if your runway has massive cracks in it and you can't land in it because your PFC isn't high enough to fund a resurfacing project, or if your terminal is falling down if there's a minor earthquake, we have to think about that too. So safety measures into this conversation. So proposals, of course, to raise this cap have been unsuccessful to this point. Airlines quite rightly have opposed it, and we absolutely understand why. But we also understand we're at a point where unless some funding comes from some other source, we're going to have trouble continuing to fund the system as we know it today. And so in Canada, the Canadian average, they call it a PFF, passenger facility fee, is about $21. Now, that's not sitting well, of course, with a lot of the Canadian carriers, but that's largely because our Canadian airports don't get all that grant money and funding from the government, so they have to fund everything themselves. Does that mean we should have a $21 PFC here in the United States? No, absolutely not, because we still do have money that's coming from ticket taxes and what have you that can be funneled into our airports. But it's something we're going to have to think really hard about as we think about the future safety of our aviation infrastructure. And so it seems like an easy argument for the carriers to make that fares go up and no one's going to buy a ticket. And it seems like an easy argument for an airport to make, yeah, but my facility's unsafe. We're going to have to find some common ground moving forward. And I'm glad that I don't get paid enough to worry about that, because I don't want to be the guy that's trying to figure that out. But I bring it up as a point of discussion. When we're talking about airlines pushing for lower cost, I know that probably everyone in this room has had that conversation, and it's a valid conversation, because the airports that I work for that have the lowest cost are the ones where I have the most success in recruiting additional service. And the airports that I have that have the lowest cost are the ones that have sustainable service that doesn't come and go. And so low costs are key to everything when you're competing with other airports. So our airline revenue, let's talk specifically about that. Our landing fees, our rent, our PFCs. Lower costs are the key in the new airline funding model, mainly because this is fuel as a percentage of airline cost to operate. Go back to 1995, fuel was about 11% of what it cost an airline to operate on a daily basis. Today it's 36%. Airlines have no control over this bottom line cost. Sure, they can hedge, but that's a big gamble, because when fuel goes down, they lose even more money. So this being the single largest expense for carriers and carriers not having control over it means that they have to look elsewhere to cut costs when times are tight. And the elsewhere is everybody in here. Congratulations on being the elsewhere. But that's what it is. That's just how it is. And so I want to show some examples of low airport costs and what they've meant for service. And I want to focus here on our friends down in the Tampa-St. Pete area here, Tampa International and St. Petersburg Clearwater International. So this is the airline CPE, the cost per enplanement at these specific airports. So PIE, $1.94, and Tampa is $4.99. So Tampa, still a great CPE. I mean, ask any airline in the room, they'll say, $5, that's great. Our average is much higher than that. Well, if you look at that CPE for Allegiant, because you'll know Allegiant's at St. Pete, and it's pretty clear why they chose St. Pete. The Allegiant adjusted one-way fare after airport costs is about $3 higher at PIE than it would be at Tampa, simply because the airport cost is lower per enplanement. And so when you adjust the fare revenue, it's almost $1 million a year in additional fare revenue that Allegiant is able to collect because the CPE is $3 different. $1 million. It adds up in a hurry. And if you look at what Tampa's airport cost would do to Allegiant's cost, it would reduce Allegiant's revenue by 4%. 4%. That's the difference between it making money and losing money. This is huge. So every cent of CPE makes a difference to the people who land at your airport. And I know I'm not telling you anything you don't already know, but it's important to think about these examples in real life with real money. They're huge. And so while we talk about a PFC needing maybe to be revised and everything else, I'm kind of talking out the other side of my face because I'm saying lower your costs. But we have strategies in this room to lower costs. And I'm not a shill for AirIT. They haven't paid me a dime to be here. I think what they do is important. That's why I'm here. So when we look at the future of how our airports are funded, it's kind of scary. It's kind of exciting. Scary things are exciting. So we have to think about how all of these different dynamics going on are going to lead to service, are going to lead to service being sustained, and are going to make our airports self-sustaining. And self-sustaining is the key, right? We want to be self-sustaining as a business. And so I want to walk through some examples of what some other airports have done to become self-sustaining. And it's not going to work. Every example that I'll show you is not going to work in every case. And you can say, well, I don't have any situation like that. That doesn't make sense for me. And I understand. And I'm not saying you should do these things at your airport. I am merely bringing them up as points of discussion, again, because they're great things to think about as we think about moving forward in what we do. So these are all those revenue sources I showed you already, all the same ones. And we think about then other revenue sources that we have. So you've got parking revenue, of course. Probably all of you have that. I'll go off on just a slight rant here on free parking. Does anybody here have free parking that I'm going to offend really badly? Okay, just one, maybe. I'm not going to offend you that badly. I believe in paid parking. I have never once, and if you can show me this, I'd be happy to see it. I have never once seen a justifiable study that proved to me that charging for parking changed consumer behavior on the airport they're going to use when they want to go somewhere. I have never once seen that. So I would love it if someone would show me that, and then I could quit making this diatribe, or this speech. Speech is better. But never have I seen real data that shows me the free parking airport down the road got 3 more passengers because the $5 parking guy charged $5. Consumers do not think about parking when they purchase plane tickets. They don't even think about bag fees in most cases. They definitely aren't worried about $5 or $7 or $8 for parking. Now, they can be influenced to park in different places with different fees and all that kind of stuff, and we've seen that. But parking is the greatest source of revenue an airport can generate. And so I highly recommend everybody to consistently look at their charges, optimize charges for parking. Some cases that may be lowering parking charges to increase volume. In other cases it could be raising. Portland, Oregon, that's where I'm based. Our company is based in Oregon. The Portland airport had a parking crunch in its long-term garage, and so now long-term garage parking is $23 a day, and that's outrageous. And the lot is still full. It is still full. In fact, yesterday, I couldn't even get a spot in that lot. 6,000 spaces, $23 a day, packed. Used to be 18 a year ago. So people will pay for what they value. And that's exactly what happens with parking. So keep that in mind. I've spoken on parking far too long. I'm passionate about parking too. I don't like paying $23 a day though, and I think I'm getting ripped off. Just between you and me. So the other big thing that we have that many airports don't leverage and potentially could is non-aeronautical revenue from land leases. I'll speak more specifically about that in just a moment. And then we, of course, have operational efficiencies. And this is really why we're all here in this room together today. I've seen this work for some of my airports in ways that I didn't expect it would. But the ability to have the exact same infrastructure you have today, but to run a lot more passengers through it, by merely changing out what technology you have at your gates or at your check-in or throughout the terminal. The ability to add capacity without major capital expenditures is going to be key when airlines start adding seats back. And so that's where AirIT really comes in, is the ability to, well, I was talking about this just a bit ago, to have a pipe that any airline can send its information through. I mean, that's just a phenomenal way to look at the ability that we have now to increase capacity. What AirIT's product does, in my mind, is provide me with a pipe, just like a water pipe, and I can put a bunch of different types of fluid through it. Because I can put United or Southwest or JetBlue or whoever through the exact same pipe, and when it comes out the other side, it looks just like it went through a JetBlue pipe. That's amazing. And the ability to leverage that to better use what we have already can change the amount of money we spend in the future and continue to reduce cost. The other big thing is using data that we can develop from these systems to help us better make good decisions about how we not only leverage capacity, but how we grow our facility over time. So I want to show you Atlanta. I call this a diversification example. The airline CPE in Atlanta, partially influenced by just the sheer volume of people. I mean, holy cow, can you believe the number of people go through that airport? I mean, those concourses at peak times, they're insane. It's like you're a salmon just trying to get to your gate. $2.36. The average is $9.26 in the United States. So they have a big time cost per enplanement advantage. But part of that comes from the way they've managed that facility and being able to scale the operation based on what they need at any time. And so look at the ratio of revenue in Atlanta. You have airline and rental car and parking here and the land lease. They have a nice mix of revenue that's coming in. And because of that, what we've seen is that airlines continue to add seats. They add seats for two reasons. One, the sheer volume of connections make a lot of things work that you wouldn't think would work, like Atlanta to Kalispell, Montana. Who thought? I pitched it, but I was skeptical, and it's done amazing because of the sheer volume of connections. And the other thing is just the fact that it's so cost effective to put a seat there relative to another hub. A big thing that's happened in the Delta network, and a big reason Cincinnati and Memphis were no longer competitive in that network, was because their cost was so much higher than Atlanta's. And so when Delta went to connect a passenger through Atlanta, it cost $2.50. And when they went to connect a passenger through Memphis, it was closer to this overall average. And so every time Delta put that passenger through Atlanta, it made $7 more. Over time, that adds up in a hurry. I want to talk a little bit about Burbank, California. 11% of their budget comes from airline fees. 11%, that's it. 11%. Their cost per enplanement passenger is $2.42. They have 62% of their budget by leveraging passenger sources of revenue. So as people come through the terminal, as people use the terminal, as people use the facilities, they're spending money. The big thing is valet. They're in Hollywood. They were looking at their parking operation. They said, this just isn't making money, and our garage is small, and we have earthquakes, and to build a new one, it's going to be billions of dollars, potentially. We'd be better off just to move the airport. It would cost less. How do we leverage all this ground parking that nobody wants? Everybody's getting dropped off. We're not getting any money. And they sat around, and they thought, and they said, what if we valet? We put up a big covered valet stand so that on the rare occasions it rains, like once a year, and it's the lead story on the news, and everyone freaks out because it's sprinkling. Yes. My wife's from LA, can you tell? I see this stuff all the time. What we're going to do is have people pull in and leave their car, and then we can park those cars way away on the other side of the airport where nobody cares. And then we can take some of the parking land we have that's right adjacent to the airport and redevelop that as commercial space. And what we're going to do to ensure that people use the valet is we're going to price it cheaper than if they park themselves. So it'll cost us a little more per car, but if we price it cheaper, we'll influence consumer behavior and make people park there. And it'll be so convenient compared to LAX, we'll retain our passengers. And come to find out, that's exactly what's happened. Today, valet is $8 cheaper than parking your car yourself. And as long as you provide them with your flight information, as soon as you come off your flight, even if it's delayed, your car is just waiting right there for you. And they have leveraged a huge growth in their parking revenue by thinking this way. So leveraging that passenger spending. So Burbank gets about $1.85 in concession revenue, which is relatively high compared to the other airports in the LA basin. They get $9.33 in parking revenue versus Ontario, which gets $6.65. So the valet makes a difference. But it's leveraging things that are unique to your position too. So that won't work everywhere, obviously, but it was just thinking about something a different way. Rental car revenue, they're lower. They don't have as many inbound tourists who use their airport. So they have to get that revenue in other places. And then you look at their overall passenger revenue, though, they're generating $14 per passenger, not including a PFC, just from the things that they've done to leverage what they had already. One other thing I'll say about them, in addition to using the valet as a way to influence consumer behavior and to not have to invest in a new parking garage, which saved a lot of money, they freed up about 2 acres right on Hollywood Boulevard that they were able to use, that was parking. They had to have the parking. They can take the valet cars right across the street. It doesn't matter. Nobody would park across the street because you have to walk across the street. So they take the cars over there where nobody wanted that space anywhere, and right next to the airport they put in a retail center, you know, shops and restaurants and everything else. And so what happens is people come and they drop people off and they aren't parking, but they're spending money at the retail center. And that generates $4.5 million a year for the airport too. So they didn't build a new garage. They were able to better leverage the land they already had, and they were able to lower the airline costs, which has helped them ensure that Southwest stays strong. That's their big carrier and continues to grow. So I don't mean to belabor it, but it was a way of thinking about the revenue problem globally and coming up with one solution, all based around, oh my God, how are we going to build a parking garage? I mean, that's what that was all based around. And so we have to think about things a different way. I want to talk about St. Pete Clearwater, and then I'll get through this, and then we can open up to discussion, because I've been talking far too long. I could talk all the time. I could take the whole day, and then AirIT would be really upset that they brought me here. So I won't do that. But again, let's talk about the CPE at St. Petersburg Clearwater, $1.94 actually. And so this is FY12 number. If you look at FY13, which we just got recently, they're down to about $1.64. So if they were in the room, they would be very upset with me. And if they hear from any of you that I had the wrong number, we may have a problem. So keep that in mind. Katie Jones, who's sitting right over here, she's a lot tougher than she looks, so beware. So PIE versus the average, much, much lower. If you look at the ratio of revenue, how they get that revenue, only 9% comes from the airline, just 9%. What they have is huge land lease revenue. They were blessed, and not all of us are, with a huge area of land adjacent to Tampa Bay. And so what they were able to do, my fingers are like so cold or something that it doesn't even think maybe I'm a vampire. I don't know. But what they were able to do is, so they have this main runway down here. It's just off the picture. That's their terminal. They have another crosswind runway. They're not a big hub, but they had this huge area of land that was designated for another parallel runway. Allegiant operates like 9 or 10 times a day. You don't need parallel runways when you're an Allegiant focus city. What you need is a flexible terminal that can handle a rush, but you don't need simultaneous approach and all that. And so looking at their master plan, they said, when are we ever going to build that runway? So probably never. Even if Allegiant was 10 times as big, we just need to figure out a way to leverage the terminal space we have to be able to house all their, or to park all their airplanes, but they could still land just fine all day long. So they were able to take that by working with the authorities, they were able to take that space that was designated for that runway and open it up into an airport business park. And so they have 200 acres there. They have hotels, they have restaurants, and they have businesses that are right adjacent to the airport, but in a very easy access spot with access to interstate highways and access to major roads. And then they use all that revenue from these businesses to offset and essentially subsidize their airline service to ensure that they're the preferred airport for the low fare conscious airline. And so the way this works is you had a big asset that would never have been used, I mean probably literally never, and now you're using it. And because you're using it, you're serving your community better by ensuring that the airlines that are there are going to stay there because you're more attractive than any other option that they have. San Jose, I lied. I have some other things I want to talk about. Go figure. I'll quickly mention San Jose because this is important. You know, they built this new terminal and everybody said it was this giant terminal and it was so big and everything else. The real story is it's actually smaller than the original plans. It's 4 gates smaller than the original plans, and it's $100 million less in construction cost than original plans because of their technology selection. It's shared use everything. Everything is shared, which means you don't need as many gates because it can be an Alaska gate and it can be a JetBlue gate and it can be a United gate. In 3 hours you can have 3 airlines. This saved a ton of money. And then it's the little things you think about. And the guys in this room can help with this. I don't really even know what any of this means. I just know how to type it. But I know it's good. So there. So $112,000 was saved by using a thin client screen instead of a PC at each screen. So the client is fed from a mainframe, essentially. That's right, right? Something like that. I'm in the neighborhood. I'm not a tech guy. I have never even held an iPad until today. This is an iPad, right? It doesn't look like my PC. That's all I know. Normally I have a clicker, and then I can even be more demonstrative. I don't want to break the iPad. Although I did hear that we're just going to throw this out and somebody's going to win it, right? Okay. You have his word. So by not putting a PC at every single screen, that saved $112,000. Seems like a small amount, but it really does make a difference over time. And so you're able to share resources between carriers, and you also are able to improve the cash flow because of data integration. So you have billing and operations that are working together so that you don't have everybody having to constantly talk and bill and everything else. And what happens is the cash flow improves over time. And so this system actually saved the carriers a lot more money, I think, than the carriers realize. It actually saved the airport a lot more money than a lot of people realize. And maybe it's that all of us in the industry haven't done a good enough job explaining how this worked to help. So let's close on how do we create a successful future airport. This is so easy. I mean, we're just solving the world's problems here. I mean, after this, we're going to just start talking about how to get Republicans and Democrats to talk. We're just going to dive into everything that's uncomfortable. So creating a successful future airport has to be able to flex with demand. So when there is high demand, if you're in St. Pete on a Friday and a Sunday, you have to be able to handle a lot more planes than you need to be able to handle on a Tuesday. So you have to flex with where the demand is, and you don't want to do that by adding a whole bunch of space. A great example for this, and I don't know if he's here, but is Vail Eagle, Colorado. Hey, Now, I couldn't see you. I can't see. I don't know if you've noticed that. I have these Coke glasses I wear. Vail is a great example because in the wintertime, they are packed to the point where they cannot even get planes into gates. That is how packed they are. And then in the summer, they're empty. And so they have to be able to handle massive traffic flow in the winter without having a huge facility that costs so much just to heat and air condition and whatever else in the summer that it drains all the money they made in the winter. By the way, charging for parking there, it doesn't really matter. So I understand your situation. Everybody's coming there. I mean, come on. I don't think I'd charge for parking there. You make about $7 a year. So it's not that bad. I say that for dramatic effect. At any rate, in Eagle, you have to be very careful about how you expand an airport to handle that wintertime just influx of passengers without making it so expensive to operate that you can never break even. And they've done a really good job, and they continue to do a good job by ensuring that every gate can be used by any different airline. So scaling with demand. That's number one. So then we get to number two, generating revenue from non-airline sources. We've been through that. Passenger traffic to sustain an airport's mission. Retail and other services to help support low costs for airlines to ensure that airlines stay engaged and keep expanding in your market. Leveraging gateway access, which means roads and rail, and bringing the city into the airport. I think this is one we didn't talk much about. We don't have time to talk a lot about it. But bringing the great things about your city into the airport. So my love-hate relationship with Portland, who charges me $23 to park my car and makes me very angry, also has the very best Portland restaurants in that airport. And it makes me very happy every time when I can go to one of my favorite restaurants, Burgerville, and I can get a great burger that I can only get in Portland before I leave on my flight. The city in the airport is critical. And I'm sorry we don't have more time to talk about that. Incentivizing service, not through incentives, not through giving cash away, but by having low costs every single day. Now I sound like Walmart, but that's what it is, right? The best incentives are not writing a check for $500,000, although the airlines would say they would love to have a check for $500,000 and you can make it out to the CEO, it'd be just fine. But long-term, low costs are what encourage sustained growth and sustained service. So low costs are going to be way more important when we see evaluation by carriers in the future of your market. And finally, your technology selection. And this ties in with everything that's here. Flexible technology to allow you to provide low costs, to allow you to best utilize the resources you have without having to spend a fortune on expansion for things that you don't need it for every day. And technology that helps you run the airport more efficiently to reduce your overhead. So when we think about success in the future from Sixel's perspective, this is what we encourage our airports to think about. And so with that, I want to bring it back around full circle, and then we'll have 10 or 15 minutes to chat if we want to. And if not, you'll have 10 or 15 minutes to drink coffee, which is fine too. But I want to bring it back to the thing I opened with, and the fact that for the first time in my life, I opened with something genuine. That's ridiculous. That person needs a raise. Mark that down. Remind me of that. And that is that we exist to connect people to the things that are important in their lives. That's what we can never forget. We can talk about all this stuff, and we can talk about technology, and we can talk about what other airports are doing, and we can talk about all the challenges we face and how uncertain our future is. But the one thing that will never be uncertain in our lives, any of our lives in this industry, is that our importance to our communities cannot be understated. The people in our communities rely upon us in an interconnected world to get to the things that are important to them. I live in Oregon. My family lives in North Carolina and in Illinois and in Southern California. And in order for me to be an integral part of those families, I rely upon my local airport and my airlines. And so everything we do, we need to think about that person. We always hear end user. We hear, customer, consumer. No, we need to think about the people who get on the planes. I recently worked on a service launch in a community that had never had service before, Topeka, Kansas. United came in there about 6 months ago, and I was on the inaugural, the first time I'd actually ever taken an inaugural flight that I had worked on. And I'd never been able to talk to people who came up to me and said, you know what, this flight is going to change my life. Because of this flight, I have 4 hours a week more with my kids. Because of this flight, I'm able to see my grandma back in New York, who's 91. So I hope that we all, when we go through this conference, when we go through this year, we all think about those people, because that's who we work for. And those people are the people who really matter in what we do. And so with that, I'm happy to take questions and chat.